Section 1 of Mrs. Piozzi's Thraliana, with numerous extracts hitherto unpublished, by Charles Hughes. Quote, "Strange that a woman should write such a book as this, put down every occurrence of her life, every emotion of her heart, and call it a Thraliana, forsooth. But then I mean to destroy it." Unquote. Hester Thrale, 10th of December 1780. There are two authorities for Dr. Johnson's conversations, and especially for his conversations at Streatham, who have a claim to be considered by the side of Boswell. These are Miss Burney, afterwards Madame D'Arblay, and Mrs. Thrale, afterwards Mrs. Piozzi. Yet I suppose that Boswell has been read by 50 persons, for every reader of Madame D'Arblay's diary, and that Madame D'Arblay has been read by at least 50 for every faithful student who has read Mrs. Piozzi's books, or the 2 volumes published in 1861 by Mr. Abraham Hayward, in which Mrs. Piozzi obtains a full hearing, and in which were first published extracts from Thraliana. There were 2 editions of Mr. Hayward's work published in 1861. In the first, a large slice of Thraliana is inserted en masse, and not properly incorporated with the work. It had evidently been received from Mr. Salisbury, son of Piozzi's nephew and owner of the precious manuscript, just before publication. For the second edition, a large edition had been received from Mr. Salisbury, containing most intimate and vivid passages, and all these and the preceding instalment of Thraliana are incorporated in the first volume. Without speaking disrespectfully of Hayward's work, which was carried out under great difficulties, it may be said that the contributions of Mr. Salisbury far outweigh in value the rest of the volumes as new and authoritative matter interesting to the Johnson-Boswell amateur. They are absolutely necessary to anyone who wishes to, quote, "see Boswell's Johnson steadily and to see it whole." Unquote. Mr. Salisbury told Mr. Hayward that he deemed Thraliana, quote, "of too private and delicate a character to be submitted to strangers," unquote, and since he supplied those, quote, "curious," unquote, passages, unquote, in 1861, no more of it has been published. Mr. L.B. Seeley was allowed to use Hayward's materials in his Life of Mrs. Thrale, and has recognised the importance of the Thraliana extracts. They've also caused Mrs. Thrale's case with regard to her marriage to be fairly stated by Sir Leslie Stephen in his little book on Johnson in the English Men of Letters series and in the Dictionary of National Biography. Those who have only read Boswell are quite unable to understand Mrs. Thrale's position and the inevitable unfairness of Boswell with regard to her. The unfairness was inspired not merely by literary jealousy, but by a personal grudge to one who had known Johnson longer and more intimately and loved him better. This is only a proof of the sincerity of Boswell, and in no respects affects the greatness of his literary genius, which is the main cause of our personal interest in Johnson. 30 years ago I collected books relating to Boswell's Johnson, and have long looked upon Thraliana as one of the few possible sources of fresh human interest about the Johnson circle. It was therefore a great pleasure and surprise to me to have the opportunity of perusing Thraliana from end to end. These 6-folio volumes, substantially bound and lettered Thraliana, each containing from 250 to 300 pages, were commenced on the 15th of September 1776 by the following entry. Quote, "It is many years since Dr. Samuel Johnson advised me to get a little book and write in it all the anecdotes which might come to my knowledge, all the observations which I might make or hear, all the verses never likely to be published, and, in fine, everything which struck me at the time. Mr. Thrale has now treated me with a repository and provided it with the pompous title Thraliana. I must endeavour to fill it with nonsense, new and old." End quote. While Thraliana was at my house, it was insured against fire for £5,000, nor could I say when I had perused it that the amount was excessive as things go today. It is the intimate record of her life from 1776 to 1809 by the bright and brilliant lady who was the hostess and caretaker of Johnson for 18 years, and was the friend of Johnson's friends, Reynolds, Garrick, Burke, Baretti, Burney, Boswell, and whose second marriage with Piozzi was the result of an irresistible passion in no way discreditable to her, and based on mutual affection and esteem. She was in a position to record interesting things, and she does record them most candidly and faithfully, and used to read and reread Thraliana to the end of her life. Only 3 leaves had she cut out, which relate to the time when she broke off with Piozzi and sent him to Italy, but she has frequently annotated and supplemented the record by side notes, which are sometimes of extreme interest. It is all in a plain, bold handwriting that can be read with ease, and a great deal of it has to do with forgotten scandals about her own relatives and other comparatively unimportant people. These help to make it a faithful reflection of 18th century life, but are often unsuitable for publication. When such prodigious prices are paid for a Chinese vase, a Renaissance bronze, a Houdon bust, and a rock crystal biberon, it seems to me that it would be among the less insane of the caprices of millionaires if one who loved Boswell were to pay £5,000, £10,000 or £15,000 for the manuscript of Mrs. Piozzi's Thraliana. For something absolutely unique there is no such thing as a market value. But let Thraliana speak for itself, and begin with an entry about Sir Joshua Reynolds and his sister. Quote, "I have fancied lately that there was something of this nature, jealousy, between Sir Joshua and Miss Reynolds. He certainly does not love her as one should expect a man to love a sister he has so much reason to be proud of. Perhaps she paints too well, or she has learned too much Latin and is a better scholar than her brother. And upon reflections I think it must be so. For if he only did not like her as an inmate, why should he not give her a genteel annuity and let her live where or how she likes? The poor lady is always miserable, always fretful, and she seems resolved, nobly enough, not to keep her post by flattery, if she cannot keep it by kindness. This is a flight so far beyond my power that I respect her for it, and do love dearly to hear her criticise Sir Joshua's painting, or indeed his connoisseurship, which I think she always does with justice and judgment, mingled now and then with a bitterness that diverts one." End quote. It was evidently a pleasure to Mrs. Thrale to hear attacks on the genius of Reynolds, whose, quote, "invulnerability," unquote, was probably as tedious to her as the virtue of Aristides to the ostracising Greeks. Northcote says that nothing made Sir Joshua so mad as Miss Reynolds' portraits, which were an exact imitation of all his defects. There are few references to Goldsmith, for Thraliana was not begun till 2 years after Goldsmith's death. But Mrs. Thrale gives the following anecdote at second hand. Quote, "Mrs. Montagu says, She was vastly struck with Goldsmith the first time they met. It was at some great table, I forget what, but Lady Abercorn was there, a lady of about 76 or 80 years old, and the company, remarking how young she looked, were led to mention her age and apply to the doctor. "I am no great judge," says Goldsmith, "for I never saw an old woman before, except, I mean, an apple woman or a beggar woman or some such body. Ladies always look young, I think, for they are finely dressed up. So I can't tell whether this lady looks well for her age or no. 'Tis a new species to me." End quote. A caricature drawing of Goldsmith by Bunbury is pasted in the first volume of Thraliana. The following anecdote, recorded March 1777, must not perhaps be taken as anything but a good tale. An Oxford satire on the slender examination tests of 18th century parsons. Quote, "Dr. Parker once told a story of a young fellow at Oxford who went for ordination to the famous Martin Benson, and returned rejected, and of course looking foolish enough. 'How is this?' cried his tutor. 'Why were you not ordained as we expected?' 'I don't know,' replied the other. 'Why, he asked me some cramp questions which I did not half understand.' 'What questions?' said the tutor. 'Why,' says the boy, 'he asked me who was the great mediator between God and man.' 'And what was your reply?' 'Why,' says the young fellow, 'after a moment's consideration I named the Archbishop of Canterbury.' 'Lockhead!' exclaims the tutor. 'Didn't you know that the Archbishop and Benson have had a quarrel? If you had named any other bishop on the bench it would have been done.' End quote. The Martin Benson of this story was created Bishop of Gloucester in 1752, and is regarded as one of the most learned and pious of 18th century bishops. Many of them had learning, but very few were remarkable for piety. Readers of Boswell feel very well acquainted with Bennet Langton and his wife, the Countess of Rothes, but even the indiscreet Boswell could not write quite so freely for the public as Mrs. Thrale in the privacy of Thraliana. She gives a very amusing description of the wasteful and shiftless ways of Bennet Langton's father and mother, which she must have heard from Johnson, and which I omit with some reluctance, and then begins on Langton himself and his wife, Lady Rothes. Quote, "This Mr. Langton, however, was to have repaired the fortune of the family and married a rich wife, for he is pious, learned and elegant, and well qualified to make his addresses to any lady. To the grief and astonishment of all his true friends, they now behold him tied to a thing without beauty, birth, money or talents, widowed to an old Scotch peer who wanted a son in his old age, and took a fresh Lowland lass for that purpose with more probability than success. She is a Presbyterian too, to make her more fit for Langton, who was a Tory and high churchman up to the eyes. But that, as he observes, is a small fault, for, says he, I shall take her to church, and she will go, of course, and not find out the difference. She does so, and they seem to live vastly happy as can be, and ask their friends to dine with them, lords, ladies, anybody, upon a piece of boiled beef and a loin of veal only, without anything else. All this with an insensibility truly admirable." August the 13th, 1777. Yesterday I dined at Sir Joshua Reynolds, Richmond Hill. Some agreeable people were raked together, and we intended to have a charming day of it. But Mr. Garrick was sick, and Lady Rothes was troublesome. She brought the babies with her, both under 6 years old, which, though the prettiest babies in the world, were not wanted there at all. They played and prattled, and suffered nobody to be heard but themselves. We ancient maids, sterile wives, and disappointed parents were peevish to see others happier than ourselves, and a little boy who, naughty as we called him, 3 people there would have been glad to purchase with £10,000, Garrick, Thrale, and old Deputy Patterson, who married a second wife on purpose, but could not obtain his wish." End quote. It ought to be mentioned to justify Mrs. Thrale's description of herself as a disappointed parent that she had lost both her sons by death and had only daughters living. As these extracts from Thraliana are given in order of time, as they were entered by Mrs. Thrale in her volumes, they must inevitably appear scrappy, and they jump from one subject to another, but this gives the same effect as does the actual reading of Thraliana, which is something between a diary and a commonplace book, and is a delightful jumble of family troubles, gossips, scandal, political events, amusing tales, and serious reflections. I do not remember having seen elsewhere a tale told by Johnson about Garrick when he first appeared as King Richard in London. A rich and noble lady fell in love with him and sent a go-between to propose marriage, but the proposals dropped, and it was only after a year or so that Garrick met the intermediary and discovered the cause. Quote, "Well," she said, "the truth is the best excuse. I will tell you. My friend fell in love with you playing King Richard, but seeing you since in the character of the lying valet, you looked so shabby, pardon me, sir, that it cured her of her passion." End quote. Mrs. Thrale records a smart saying of her own when she was in Paris at the time of the outbreak of the American Rebellion. She has used it in one of her published works. Quote, "A French gentleman, whose place was near mine at the Opera, asked me in a sneering manner how we should do to conquer America, adding that he fancied it would be somewhat difficult. 'Perhaps so,' I replied, 'now 'tis defended by Englishmen. I remember it was easy enough to take it from the French.'" End quote. The following description of Mr. Cumberland proves that Sheridan did not overdraw his caricature in Sir Fretful Plagiary in the Critic. Quote, "Mr. Cumberland's delicacy is very troublesome, his peevishness very teasing, and his envy very hateful. He looks to me like a man that has been poisoned, so sallow is his complexion, and so sunk are his eyes. Yet his person is genteel, and his manner elegant, but he professes to be easily galled, and says of himself that he was born without a skin. Effeminacy is, however, an odious quality in the creature, and when joined with a low jealousy, actually detestable. He is a man one cannot love." End quote. I suppress a rather scandalous note annexed to this passage by Mrs. Piozzi at a later date. As an introduction to an account of a conversation on love with Dr. Johnson, in which he expressed his usual common sense and unromantic views, she remarks, quote, "As my peace has never been disturbed by the soft passion, so it seldom comes into my head to talk of it." End quote. During this conversation, Johnson defended all amusements as combating the tedium vitae. Quote, "Cards, dress, dancing, all found their advocates in Johnson. Somebody would say, 'Such a lady never touches a card.' 'How then does she get rid of her time?' says Johnson. 'Does she drink drams?' 'Such a person never suffers gentlemen to buzz in his daughter's ears.' 'Who is to buzz in her ears then, the footman?' End quote. The following tale may be recommended to the members of the Anti-Vivisection Society, and it will be all the more suitable for them as it bears the marks of exaggeration and imagination. Quote, a fellow brought his dog to a doctor for dissection. "Pray, friend," inquires the doctor, "is not that the dog which once saved your life? And have you the cruelty to bring him here to be dissected?" "Well, really," answers the clown, "I do believe the poor beast loves me so, that if he knowed I should get a crown by it, he would have come voluntary." End quote. Mrs. Thrale has written in these volumes several tales unfit to tell in a mixed company, but we must remember that this was a private record, and that she had possibly heard some of these smoke-room stories from Thrale in private. And then, of course, the 18th century was not precisely mid-Victorian. She had, however, her own strong feelings of propriety. Quote, at a dinner party at Mr. Deputy Patterson, his wife insisted on reciting some impromptu verses which her husband had composed at the age of 72 in honour of a reigning beauty. They were repeated with great gravity and in a theatrical tone. When Daphne fled Apollo's arms, and in a laurel veiled her charms, his godship longed to bark her. So I do hate the nuzzling pride of lace and gauze that strive to hide the charms of Kitty Parker. Editor's note: Mrs. Thrale writes out 4 more stanzas, back to main text. Well, now to be sure, these verses are very happy, very sprightly, very clever, considering they were run off all impromptu. But they are such verses as I should have thought no lady would have repeated in mixed company. End quote. Nevertheless, Mrs. Thrale must have asked Mrs. Patterson for a copy of those charming verses, for she would hardly have been able to carry them in her memory from a single hearing. Mrs. Thrale has written in these pages a long account of her own family, much of which has been published by Hayward, but that gentleman was not entrusted by Mr. Salisbury with the following account of the diarist's own father, Mr. John Salisbury, of Barchy Craig, who seems to have been rather like one of the heroes of Fielding's novels. Quote, my father, turning out a wild young fellow with spirit to spend money and earnest desire to give it away whenever it seemed to be wanted, and soon very little to spend or give, and resolved to come to London and try his fortune, as 'tis called here, he fell in with a very famous woman, Miss Harriet Edwards, who, having struck out for herself a new plan of happiness, resolved to act the man and the libertine. She was a young person of large and independent fortune, who set reputation at naught and scandal at defiance, resolved to avoid marriage and yet have a son on whom to settle her estate. Editor's note: she would be considered quite a forward feminist even now. Back to main text. Took, as I have been told, a fancy to my father, whom she supplied with money as long as her taste to his company subsisted, and when they parted, he picked up another female friend, a Mrs. Stradwick, who, being divorced from her husband, led a libertine life till all her pelf was exhausted. When these resources failed my father, he went abroad as cicerone to his relation, Sir Robert Cotton of Combermere, who paid his expenses and was pleased with his company. The more, perhaps, as he did not suspect the attachment his own sister Hester had to him, and the regular correspondence they had long continued to maintain. My mother became so lovely a creature, both in body and mind, that her brother Sir Robert grew proud of her, and she was always about with him and Lady Betty, who introduced her into gay life when she received many advantageous proposals of marriage. She, however, declined accepting any, having secretly set her heart upon her flashy cousin John. And when her fortune was settled and she became independent, she resolved to bestow it and herself on my father, for whose necessities it was by no means sufficient, being only £7,000 and an annuity of £125 per annum for the life of her mother, the Lady Cotton, who was no longer young, and having had 2 more children by Captain King, seemed to be quite worn out. Well, my father durst not return with Sir Robert from France, lest this attachment to his sister should be discovered. So he stayed at Lyons 6 months with a French marquise, who died in his arms, and left him the little he had not spent of hers before. Note, the gold-headed cane which I gave Mr. Thrale was a present from that lady. With this little money he came home and married Miss Hester Maria Cotton. His brother, Sir Robert Cotton, protested he would never see them more." They lived in Carnarvonshire in poverty and dissension till the daughter became a link between them. "Rakish men seldom make tender fathers, but a man must fondle something, and nature pleads her own cause powerfully when a little art is likewise used to help it forward. I therefore grew a great favourite, it seems, in spite of his long-continued efforts to dislike me, and now that they had a centre of unity in this offspring, for which they were both equally interested, they began to agree a little better, I believe, and bear with patience their irrevocable lot. And now 9 years of mutual misery had been endured, when Sir Robert Cotton, soured by having no children of his own, and disliking to excess the lady whom his next brother and immediate heir had chosen, began to hear of his once favourite sister, and made overtures of peace. During these 9 years my mother had never bought but 1 new gown, that cost only 1 guinea of a pedlar that had come about the country. She made her own candles, salted her own meat, ironed her own linen, and her husband's and mine, and if he could but have been good-humoured, protested she would have been happy." As a fair account of Mrs. Thrale's life up to the time of her marriage is given in Hayward's and Seeley's books, it will be unnecessary to give any more extracts about her relatives or the circumstances, recorded after 15 years, of her marriage to Mr. Thrale, a mariage de raison, arranged for her by her mother and uncle. It was not an unsuitable marriage, but Mrs. Thrale is modest enough to think that one of the chief of her attractions in Mr. Thrale's eyes was her willingness to live much of her life in the house in the Borough, near the Southwark Brewery. The house at Streatham was for Thrale rather a suburban than a country house, for he was quite determined not to have a "neighbourhood" there, but to depend for society on friends from London. His old bachelor friends, Murphy, Bodens, Fitzpatrick, Captain Conway and others, were at first the amis de la maison. Mrs. Thrale says, "I liked none of them but Murphy, and my mother despised them all." But it was Murphy who introduced Johnson, and so made the house famous forever in English literary history. End of section 1. Section 2 of Mrs. Piozzi's Thraliana by Charles Hughes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. At the end of the 2nd volume of Thraliana we have a description of Mrs. Thrale's own person and mind, of which I quote the latter. "The character of the mind is, however, almost wholly Italian." This was written before she was acquainted with Piozzi. Or rather Welsh, perhaps, for her temper is warm even to irascibility, affectionate and tender, but claiming such returns to her tenderness and affection as busy people have no time to pay, and coarse people have no pleasure in paying. She is a diligent and active friend, who spares neither money nor pains to oblige, but is soon disgusted if the person obliged does not express the sense of obligation. By nature a rancorous and revengeful enemy, but having conquered that quality by God's grace, she is now apt really and bona fide to forget when and how she was offended." End quote. At the beginning of Volume 3, on the 19th of May 1778, she mentions that the black letter title, Thraliana, is written by Sophie Stretfield, but as very full extracts about that fair lady and her flirtations were furnished by Mr. Salisbury to Hayward and printed by him, they shall not be quoted here. It is curious, however, that she never mentions S.S.'s strange gift of being able to weep real tears at the word of command, as a sort of accomplishment which furnishes Miss Burney with a lifelike descriptive passage. Here follows a most remarkable tabular character sketch of the society of Streatham, based on a system of marks for different qualities, 20 being full marks. Quote, Johnson: religion 20, morality 20, scholarship 19, general knowledge 20, person and voice 0, manners 0, wit 15, humour 15, good humour 0. Murphy: religion 1, morality 4, scholarship 15, general knowledge 6, person and voice 13, manners 15, wit 17, humour 15, good humour 15. Dr. Burney: religion 18, morality 18, scholarship 8, general knowledge 15, person and voice 13, manners 16, wit 0, humour 3, good humour 19. Garrick: religion 10, morality 15, scholarship 3, general knowledge 16, person and voice 18, manners 17, wit 19, humour 19, good humour 0. Seward: religion 0, morality 17, scholarship 12, general knowledge 14, person and voice 9, manners 10, wit 18, humour 0, good humour 0. Boswell: religion 5, morality 5, scholarship 5, general knowledge 10, person and voice 10, manners 8, wit 7, humour 3, good humour 19. Bodens: religion 0, morality 0, scholarship 0, general knowledge 10, person and voice 6, manners 15, wit 15, humour 15, good humour 15. Thrale: religion 18, morality 17, scholarship 9, general knowledge 9, person and voice 18, manners 17, wit 0, humour 0, good humour 0. Burke: religion 16, morality 10, scholarship 14, general knowledge 19, person and voice 12, manners 14, wit 0, humour 0, good humour 0. Sir John Lade: religion 0, morality 0, scholarship 0, general knowledge 5, person and voice 10, manners 9, wit 0, humour 0, good humour 0. Baretti, religion 0, morality 6, scholarship 6, general knowledge 17, person and voice 4, manners 6, wit 0, humour 5, good humour 0. Dr. Beattie, religion 18, morality 18, scholarship 11, general knowledge 7, person and voice 7, manners 6, wit 0, humour 0, good humour 0. James Harris, religion 0, morality 10, scholarship 20, general knowledge 10, person and voice 5, manners 3, wit 0, humour 0, good humour 0. Langton, religion 18, morality 18, scholarship 17, general knowledge 6, person and voice 5, wit 0, humour 0, good humour 0. Cator, religion 0, morality 0, scholarship 0, general knowledge 13, person and voice 3, manners 0, wit 0, humour 0, good humour 0. End quote. It contains a great deal in a small space. The celebrity of some of the persons, and the fact that the marks were given by a keen-witted woman who knew them all intimately, gives it a quite unique interest. Some of the names in Thraliana are not given here, among others Sir Joshua Reynolds. The reason that Sir Joshua's character is not quoted is that in his case the columns of religion and morality are left blank. This means that as to the religion and morality of the President of the Royal Academy, Mrs. Thrale had not been able to make up her mind. It is clear that she did not like him very much, so that her agnosticism as to his religion and morality may be taken as want of sympathy. Quote, by good humour is meant only the good humour necessary to conversation. End quote. Mrs. Thrale evidently meant that combination of good humour and good temper which enables people to stand argument, contradiction and chaff without irritation or resentment. There is another elaborate table, which I do not reproduce, about the lady visitors to Streatham, but the headings are different. Mrs. Thrale remarks, quote, they must possess virtue in the contracted sense, or one would not keep 'em company. End quote. One of these virtuous dames, however, she suspects of having had an illegitimate child. She gives several remarkable tales of dreams and warnings which she had heard of from others, and one that happened to herself is striking and impressive, though it is impossible to avoid the criticism that it is not entered in Thraliana till more than 2 years after the event. Quote, when I myself was at Lille in Flanders in the year 1775, I walked with Mr. Johnson and Mr. Thrale round the great church there, and in one of the chapels I observed myself to stumble in an odd manner so as to give me uncommon pain, and at the same time to excite strange ideas of terror wholly unaccountable to me, who am neither timorous nor over-delicate. I looked at the altarpiece and saw it was the figure of an angel protecting a boy about 12 years old, as it should seem, and somehow the child struck me with a resemblance to my own, and alarmed me in an unusual manner. I prayed for the safety of my young ones, and as I came out of the chapel, I asked an old man to whom that chapel was dedicated. He replied, to the guardian angel of children. I resolved to walk round the church and go into every chapel in it to see if I should stumble in them. I could not stumble, however, but when I returned with better spirits to the children's chapel, I stumbled again and even hurt myself. The impression it made alarmed me, and as I could not rid myself of the uneasiness it caused, I told Mr. Johnson in the afternoon, when Hester was gone to play with her papa. He bid me be careful not to encourage such fancies, and talking the thing through cleared my head a bit for a time. Soon after our return from abroad, however, I was dreadfully alarmed by my son's sudden illness and death, and though he continued ill but 3 hours, this old superstition haunted me all the while, the more perhaps as I had 2 days before, going down to dinner with company, when he was perfectly well at school, heard something like a preternatural voice, that of his guardian angel perhaps, call me by my name. But this I never mentioned to anyone, lest I should be suspected of madness, but mad I am not. I have the best health in the world, no indigestion, no headaches, no vapours, no change of weather affects me, nor did even the loss of my only son lay stronger hold on my heart than was utterly impossible to avoid. My mind is an active whirligig mind, which few things can stop to disturb, and if disturbed, it soon recovers its strength and its activity." End quote. With this we may compare the following entry, which, for the sake of the contrast, I have taken a little out of its proper order in Thraliana. Quote, 24th of September 1779, Friday. I've got a strange fit of the horrors upon me to-day. Something runs in my head that I shall die, or Mr. Thrale shall die, and that we shall not, as we hoped, communicate at God's table next Sunday. I will say nothing of it, for it may end in nothing, but I'm not used to be low-spirited, and 'tis very odd to be so now, for I ail nothing, though I tremble with terror, just as I was before my son died. If nothing does happen, I will never mind low spirits again. Monday, the 4th of October, 1779. Nothing happened. We did communicate together last Sunday se'nnight, and tomorrow we set out for Tunbridge Wells and Brighthelmstone. End quote. I must now quote a very remarkable passage in which Mrs. Thrale records, in 1779, an account of some great passion or scandal in Johnson's life, to which she makes no further reference in the length and breadth of Thraliana. Quote, "It appears to me that no man can live his life quite through without being at some period of it under the dominion of some woman, wife, mistress, or friend. Pope and Swift were softened by the smiles of Patty Blunt and Stella, and our own stern philosopher Johnson trusted me about the years 1767 or 1768, I know not which just now, with a secret far dearer to him than his life. Such, however, is his nobleness and such his partiality, that I sincerely believe he has never since that day regretted his confidence, or ever looked with less kind affection on her who had him in her power. Uniformly great is the mind of that incomparable mortal, and well does he contradict the maxims of Rochefoucauld, that no man is a hero to his valet de chambre. Johnson is more a hero to me than to anyone, and I have been more to him for intimacy than ever was any man's valet de chambre." End quote. This furnishes a fine problem for the exercise of a constructive imagination. The fact that this confidence of Johnson's, recorded, it must be remembered, more than 10 years after it was given, placed him in, quote, Mrs. Thrale's power, unquote, proves that it was not a mere flirtation or love affair, but something of which the sage had reason to be ashamed. We must remember that more than 10 years elapsed between the death of Johnson's wife and his first acquaintance with either Boswell or the Thrales, and that during this period he passed much of his time in deplorable and apparently inexcusable laziness, while supposed to be employed in preparing his edition of Shakespeare. Shortly after he became friendly with Mr. and Mrs. Thrale, they found him in a state of despondency and despair that was akin to madness. Still, we do not know the name of the woman under whose dominion Johnson passed, and it is very much to the credit of Mrs. Piozzi that we do not know it. Boswell could not possibly have kept it back. The following passage is interesting, as it shows what a real respect she had for her husband as a politician, while having no illusions whatever as to the general character of the Houses of Parliament. The House of Commons at that time was certainly not a collection of ideal men any more than it is today. Let us hope that today there are wives to be found who believe, each of them, that her own husband is the one honest man in a rotten and accursed assembly. Mrs. Thrale writes, quote, "If we have deserved help from heaven, we shall have it. But let us first inquire whether, peradventure, 10 righteous men may be found in the Houses of Parliament. When I say 10 righteous men, I mean 10 men free from the vice of the place." Note, she makes a comparison with Sodom. End note. Wholly clear from corruption or bias of any kind, or tied by any interest, for their own sakes or their friends, to any party whatever. It may, for aught I know, be saved for the sake of such 10, but I only know one myself, and that is Mr. Thrale. 5th of July, 1779. End quote. I will now present, as Mr. Frohman says, a series of extracts which show Mrs. Thrale's variety of subject and variety of tone, though all written with equal sincerity. 1. Concerning Pacchierotti, about whom we hear some scandalous tales in the extracts from Thraliana printed by Hayward. 2. About Mrs. Thrale's efforts in the cause of religion. 3. As to a young admirer at Bath. 4. A comparison between Gray the poet and Sir Joshua Reynolds the painter. 5. Reflections on a curious manuscript of Pope's, with moral observations on the amount of artifice in life. Quote, 1. Fanny Burney goes home now to study and live recluse, and, as I tell her, to kiss Pacchierotti, the castrato singer of whom they're all so fond. Pacchierotti said one day to me, when I told him my regard was of little value from my ignorance of music, "On the contrary, madam, the hard thing is mine. For how shall I reward your propensity to me, if not by my talent?" "Partiality," said I. "I beg pardon, madam, propensity." Comical enough. And so was a note of his in answer to an invitation of mine and Miss Burney's for an evening visit. "I pity myself," says he, "that I cannot pass the whole night between those two ladies, but I will give them what I can." All this with perfect innocence of any meaning whatsoever. 2. If one can mend anybody's morals or fix anybody's notions of religion, how happy does it make one? Sure, it is not mere vanity in me to fancy that I have helped forward the salvation of my husband, Mrs. Byron, Mrs. Lambert, and Sir P.J. Clarke. My children's souls are in my care, and all I can do for them is indispensable duty. Mr. Scrays, footnote, Mrs. Piozzi's trusted friend and business adviser, whom she always found worthy of every confidence, end footnote, is quite unimpressible with any religious notions, for I have worked at him, but I have often observed business disqualifies a man for heaven more than pleasure does. The thorny ground seems to be worse than the stony, and the faults which a man applauds in himself he never will be cured of. Now the pleasure hunter always condemns himself, the business hunter quite otherwise. 3. 1780, Bath. I have picked up an agreeable acquaintance here in Lord George Clinton, second son to the Duke of Newcastle. I thought at first he was in love with Hester by his close attention to me, but I believe he was only seized with the present rage among young men of following a woman of sense, as they phrase it. The pretty girls are so empty. No society pleases me but a woman of sense. A lucky folly, at least. Nor should I call it that, but I concluded affectation in this boy. However, it may be genuine, perhaps, as he thinks it is. 4. Mr. Johnson's criticism of Gray displeases many people, Sir Joshua Reynolds in particular. He professes the sublime of painting, I think, with the same affectation as Gray does in poetry. Both of them tame, quiet characters by nature, but forced into fire by artifice and effort. The time will come when some cool observer will see, or some daring fellow venture to say, of Sir Joshua's Ugolino all that Johnson has been telling of Gray's Bard. 5. 10th of December 1780. We have got a sort of literary curiosity amongst us, the foul copy of Pope's Homer, with all his old intended verses, sketches, emendations, etc. Strange that a man should keep such things. Stranger still that a woman should write such a book as this, put down every occurrence of her life, every emotion of her heart, and call it Thraliana, forsooth. But then I mean to destroy it. All wood and wire behind the scenes, sure enough. One sees that Pope laboured as hard, quote, as if the stager-rate o'erlooked each line, unquote. Indeed. And how very little effect those glorious verses at the end of the 8th book of the Iliad have upon me when one sees them in all their cradles and clouds, and light changed for bright, and then the whole altered again, and the line must end with night, and oh dear. Thus, quote, torturing one poor word 1,000 ways, unquote. Johnson said 'tis pleasant to see the progress of such a mind. True, but 'tis a malicious pleasure, such as men feel when they watch a woman at her toilet. Quote, see by degrees a purer blush arise, unquote. Wood and wire once more, wood and wire, end quote. The following remarks about Edmund Burke, the sainted Burke canonised by Lord Morley, may be read with some surprise, and certainly it is rather a shock to hear such startling tales of the comparative sobriety of the gentlemen of Wales. Perhaps, however, it is wrong to judge the Welsh country gentleman by Peacock's headlong haul, but we cannot dispute that Mrs. Thrale, quote, stayed in the house, unquote, at Beaconsfield, and that Burke was Irish. Mrs. Thrale is composing a description and verses for the portraits by Sir Joshua in the library at Streatham, and when she comes to Burke, writes as follows, quote, "'Tis now time to turn over a new leaf for the great orator, Mr. Edmund Burke, who, after I had ran from gentleman's house to gentleman's house all over Wales in the year 1774, was the first man I had ever seen drunk or heard talk obscenely when I lived with him and his lady at Beaconsfield among dirt, cobwebs, pictures and statues that would not have disgraced the city of Paris itself, where misery and magnificence reign in all their splendour and imperfect amity. Note, Irish Roman Catholics are always like the foreigners somehow, dirty and dressy, with all their clothes hanging as if upon peg. That Mrs. Burke drinks as well as her husband, and that their blackamoor carries tea about with a cut finger wrapped in rags must help to apologise for the severity with which I have treated so very distinguished a character." End quote. In Mrs. Thrale's Welsh Diary, published by Mr. Broadley in 1909, the remarks on Burke are much milder. There is much less detail about dress in Thraliana than we should naturally expect to find, but the following passage shows the natural pleasure felt by Mrs. Thrale at the sensation created by a striking costume, and it shows that the lady was before her age in consideration for the press. Quote, "My name has figured finely in the newspaper on account of my going to court on the birthday in the Owaihi pattern silk. The truth is, I had a mind partly to please the Burneys, whose captain brought me some curiosities from the South Seas and new discovered regions, particularly a scrap of cloth torn from the back of the Indian who killed Captain Cook with his club. This stuff I thought so pretty that I got Carr the mercer to imitate it in satin, and trimmed it with feathered ornaments to keep up the taste of the character, still preserving in view the fashion of the times. It was violently admired, to be sure, and celebrated in all the papers of the day, which I have a notion was owing to my own willingness to be looked at by the people who sat in the guard-room observing dresses, fashions, etc. My being used to electioneering prevents my indignation from boiling at the sight of a few honest fellows collected together, which the tom-folks call a mob. So I turned to them and smiled, and I heard them say, 'Tis Mrs. Thrale, oh, she's a good-natured lady,' etc. And so they put me in the news, I guess." End quote. Several of her friends are going abroad, and she makes the following entry, quote, "I catch myself thinking that if my master was to die and Queenie to marry, I would take my two next girls and give them a little run upon the continent before the time of flirtation should arrive, as schoolgirls are dangerous animals enough at 14 or 15 years old. Ignorant of every earthly thing but their lessons, they are a natural prey to all who venture the attack. And the fortune of my monkeys will induce attention, like the white feather in Henri IV's hat on the day of battle." End quote. Here follows an extract which shows really affectionate feeling, though it is possible that Mrs. Thrale took a pleasure in writing it, for it is very well expressed. Quote, "One page more, I see, ends the third volume of Thraliana. Strange farrago as it is of sense, nonsense, public, private follies, but chiefly my own, and I the little hero. But who should be the hero of an Anna? Let me vindicate my own vanity, if it be with my last pen. This volume will be finished at Streatham and left there. My poor little old aunt at Bath is dying, and I am dolt enough to be sincerely sorry, the more as her past kindnesses claim that personal attendance from me which Mr. Thrale will not permit me to pay her. Poor little old, insipid, useless creature. May God Almighty in His mercy pity, receive and bless her as a most inoffensive atom of humanity, for whom His only Son consented to be crucified, and among whose flock she has most innocently fed for 60 or 70 years. Here closes the third volume. Streatham, Monday the 29th of January 1781. End quote. End of section 2. Section 3 of Mrs. Piozzi's Thraliana by Charles Hughes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. As this is not a life of Mrs. Thrale, readers may be referred to Boswell, Hayward or Mr. Seeley for an account of Thrale's death, the appointment of executors and the sale of the brewery. The use of Streatham House and the income from £50,000 were left to Mrs. Thrale. Most of the important passages in Thraliana are in reference to her gradual attachment to Piozzi, her determination to marry him, and then her resolution to send him to Italy and give him up for the sake of her daughters, were communicated to Mr. Hayward by Mr. Salisbury. But the love tale is told in full by Mrs. Thrale, and it is only in Thraliana that it can be read in full. Miss Burney was the confidante. Though she was opposed to the Piozzi marriage, she did not approve of Mrs. Thrale marrying a man who was a foreigner and a Roman Catholic, but seems to have behaved with sympathy and discretion. It is curious that she should herself have afterwards married Monsieur d'Arblay, who was also a foreigner and a Roman Catholic. Mrs. Thrale had left Streatham, which was let to Lord Shelburne, the Prime Minister, and when she gave up Piozzi, retired to Bath with her daughters. Her constancy to Piozzi remained unimpaired. They wrote to each other, and she frequently sent him verses, which do not seem to have cooled his affection. Early in 1784, her daughters took pity on her. She was very ill, and was in truth dying of love for Piozzi. So Miss Thrale wrote to Milan to recall the amante adorato from his banishment. During this period she is too much agitated to write much on general topics, but the following passage in Thraliana is dated at Bath on March the 15th, 1784. Quote, "To neglect or forbear the education of our children is surely not the fault of the present age. Every boy is driven into the lists of literature, where indeed failure is now hardly a disgrace, so many and so impotent are the claimants for fame. Every female is harassed with masters she disregards, and heaped with accomplishments which she ought to disdain, when she reflects that her mother only loads her with allurements as a rustic lays birdlime on twigs to decoy and catch the unwary traveller. Like that, too, it is often laid on so unskilfully that man and bird flies instinctively away, their intention appears so very palpably. Yet is education at last an admirable thing." End quote. The marriage takes place on the 25th of July, 1784, and on September the 3rd she enters in Thraliana this heartfelt expression of satisfaction. Quote, "I have now been 6 weeks married, and enjoyed greater and longer felicity than I have ever yet experienced. To crown all, my dear daughters Susanna and Sophia have spent the day with myself and my amiable husband. We part in peace and love and harmony. And tomorrow I set off for the finest country in the world, in company with the best man in it." End quote. And so for Italy, leaving behind Johnson, who behaved very badly indeed with reference to her marriage, and for whose conduct towards his benefactress there is no sufficient excuse, and hardly any palliation. I give the following extracts from Thraliana about her travels. Quote, "Paris, 23rd of September, 1784. The Count Torconi, a hump-backed Italian nobleman who lives always here, to enjoy that liberty which great cities are sure to afford, has offered his house near Milan for us to inhabit, while he studies life all day and chemistry all night among the Parisians. I was diverted with the account of the people he lives with and whom he does not love. But anything, says he, is better than etiquette and insipidity. So I keep clear of Milano at least, and pass my life in the manner I best like." Unquote. He seems to esteem me, and so indeed do all the Italians I have yet been introduced to. Goldoni dined here one day, and we struck fire vastly well. He's such a looking man as the famous James Harris of Salisbury, and extremely garrulous. The Italians talk a great deal, but he out-talked them all. She hears on the 25th of January of Johnson's death, which had been long expected, and writes, quote, "Oh, poor Dr. Johnson," unquote. But she is herself very happy. Quote, 27th of January, Milan, 1785. Here am I, with my husband and his friends, passing my birthday, after all past anguish, in the bosom of friendship, love and good humour, with my health recovered, as far as it was recoverable, and even my looks repaired by growing fat, so as to content my ever partial, my ever kind companion. What blessings, what comforts are these, and how grateful ought I to be for a change so unhoped for, though always eagerly desired. We have a dinner and a concert, and I am fed with flattery even to repletion, but that, of course, which most delights my heart is the unfeigned pleasure which I see my Piozzi takes in my company. God has heard my prayers, and enabled me to make happy the most amiable of his sex. Was I to wish for more, I might provoke Providence to lessen the enjoyments I possess. Let me suppress all inordinate desire of a child by the man I so love. That only could add to my happiness. So passes the happiest birthday ever yet experienced by Hester Lynch Piozzi. End quote. Though she finds the Italians pleasant and amiable, she is much disgusted with their customs and superstitions and the grossness of their talk. Quote, I told Piozzi the other day that I thought Senator Morosini's talk was like nothing I ever heard of but a midwife's evidence in England upon a trial in a court of justice. I have always been partial to Peter as elder brother, though I acknowledge him neither for padre nor monsignor, but I shall now be a follower of dear Martin as much from preference as from being born and educated where his heaven-dictated Reformation is the established church. These people, by treating my notions as heretical, have made me a Protestant in despite of myself, who always used to say that, though I dissented from the Roman Church, I did not protest against it. But when they profess to worship man instead of God, 'tis time to protest against such gross impiety. No, sir, I said to a priest the other day, you do not pay divine honours either to saints or to angels, you respect them. On the contrary, madam, replied he, we adore them, and so we do the Pope, and it is heresy to oppose that adoration. Here I finished, and resolved never to speak to them on that subject more. Could I but separate my Piozzi from these goats. End quote. Having seen Venice, Rome and Naples, they returned to Milan. Quote, Milan, Casa Fedele, 27th of June, 1786. Such happiness I had once in the company of dear Dr. Johnson, whose knowledge of the world I now find to be nearly intuitive, excepting only that he could never persuade himself to think mankind so wicked as I have since found them to be. The anecdotes of his life, written by me in various parts of Italy, begun here in Milan, continued at Florence and finished at Leghorn, met, I understand, an extremely favourable reception in England. So I ought to be thankful and in good humour with my own country now, for every reason. Indeed, comparing it with others, one must allow it a gainer, though vicious enough, God knows. Our Beckfords and Bickerstaffs do not keep their male mistresses in triumph like the Roman priests and princes. This Italy is indeed a sink of sin, and whoever lives long in it must be a little tainted. England certainly does keep the golden mean, and though wickeder than one would wish it, and more defective both in faith and works, I verily do believe it is the best part of Europe to live in for almost every reason. 16th of August, 1786, Milan. I have seen a stranger thing, however, here at Milan than any critical studies can afford. Nature and her varieties are better worth studying after all than all the other sciences, could one acquire them. Dr. Johnson once said, "Nobody ever saw a strange thing," and challenged 2 or 3 friends, myself amongst them, to say I had in my life been witness to a sight justly called a strange one. But I had not then seen Avvocato Borghi, a lawyer of this town and a man well respected, who actually chews the cud like an ox, which he did in my presence and at my request. He is eminent for strength. His person, like that of another man, till stripping, he shows a set of ribs and a sternum very surprising indeed, and worthy the inspection of anatomists. His body, on a slight touch, even through his clothes, throws out electric sparks. With all these peculiarities, no man has better health, I'm told, and he is eminent for lifting great weights, holding a man in the palm of his hand, and such tricks. He can throw up his meals at pleasure, and to oblige me did go through all the operations of eating, masticating and vomiting, so as to entirely satisfy all curious inquiries I could make, and leave me no doubt of the fact which I would not have believed from the relation of any mortal now living. I could hardly have refused credit to Johnson. The Americans have got a trick of travelling, I find. It is very foolish in their government to suffer 'em. They will get spoiled. Note: the above remark is inserted in Thraliana without preface or comment. Have the Americans been spoiled or improved by continental travel? End note. 3rd of September 1786. I am exceedingly obliged to the Milanese nobility for their partial regard and tenderness towards me, whom they consider as entitled to every distinction, both by my birth and acquirements. But though they respect my fidelity to the man I have married, they scruple not to declare their opinion of its being very ill bestowed. All the gentlemen loudly proclaim their envy of Mr. Piozzi, and astonishment at his good luck in getting for his wife a dama di nascita. Note: he was not cavaliere. End note. Every man I have seen almost has made love to me. But when I found how the land lay, a steadily kept resolution never to sit with any man alone, even for 5 minutes, settled that stuff completely. The Italians are sad liars. I would not trust one of them. These old priests teasing me to change my religion is the worst thing. I am afraid of their making Piozzi hate me, and of their putting a woman about him to keep him steady in the good old cause. Milan, 15th of September 1786. Well, I am now about to close my residence in Italy at the same moment as I close my 4th volume of Thraliana, and must confess that no days since I began it have been so happily spent by me as those I have passed in this beautiful country, where my little talents have been respected much beyond their deserts, my conduct extolled far beyond its merit, and my conversation sought for from the mere prevalence of true admiration and esteem. I shall not leave people who deserve so much from me without sincere desire and fervent prayers for their future welfare. With regard to my husband, it is difficult to express how kind and how attentive he has been. May that tenderness not lessen from an idea that when I am once in England I shall need it no longer, for to that I shall owe my life, which depends entirely on him, and which his company can alone render pleasing in any nation and beneath any sky. Here then, farewell, fair Italy, say I, whilst other modes and other climes we try. End quote. And so they left Italy, where Mrs. Piozzi wrote her little book, Anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson, LL.D., during the last 20 years of his life. She sent the manuscript to England for publication by Cadell, and as it was the first book she had published, its great success and numerous editions gave her much satisfaction. End of section 3. Section 4 of Mrs. Piozzi's Thraliana by Charles Hughes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The following entry in Thraliana after their return home is made on April the 29th, 1787, and will explain Mrs. Piozzi's feelings. Quote, Vienna pleased Mr. Piozzi better than me. He found some musical houses very much to his taste, but I disliked both the city and people exceedingly. Prague was horrible. Dresden won my heart. Was I 60 years old, I should like to settle at Dresden. The Bloomsbury Square and Southampton Row are somewhat nearer, to be sure. The manners very similar. The society just such, I think. More women than men, and the men poor creatures. I made some friends, female ones, there who appeared to love me sincerely. Brunswick, Hanover and Osnaburg form a climax of misery. God keep one from ever seeing those places again. Berlin and Potsdam were superbly dull. The gallery at Düsseldorf is worth running across to look at, but Aix-la-Chapelle was a wretched place, and the spa baths made one sick to look at them. Brussels. Aye, Brussels was something like indeed. Never were people so caressed as Mr. Piozzi and I were at Brussels. The Duke and Duchess of Arenberg quite adored us. Lord and Lady Torrington professed themselves jealous of our fondness for them. The Princess Gouvernante invited our further residence in her city, and asked me if nothing she could do would induce us to stay. The Archduchesses learned English out of my book, Johnson's Anecdotes, and Prince Albert would not have Mrs. Piozzi out of his sight. We entertained 64 English friends with a concert and supper at the Hotel d'Angleterre, and dined and spent the evening with the first company every day, and we left them, much to my regret, after spending 5 weeks in gaiety and good humour. Why did we leave them? I never could tell certainly, but the best reason was the hope of seeing the mortgage to Miss Thrale's fairly discharged and cancelled. That satisfaction I expect next Thursday. As for seeing our daughters, why, we never do see them here, any more than when the sea parted us, or hardly. The eldest has called twice, and we have called twice on Susan and Sophie, who refused dining here at our invitation, perhaps from the idea that they are superior to the petty sovereigns of Germany." End quote. For 25 years Mrs. Piozzi lived in happiness and content with her second husband, who died at Brinbella, note the villa built by Piozzi on his wife's land near Denby, end note, in 1809. They never went abroad again, no doubt because the French Revolution and the constant warfare which resulted from it were interferences with travelling, and especially with visits to Italy, to which Englishmen had been so much inclined from the time of Henry VIII, visits for study and pleasure that seemed almost a necessary part of a polite education. Suffice it to say that Mr. and Mrs. Piozzi returned for a time to Streatham, and afterwards made their headquarters in Wales, on Mrs. Thrale's ancestral estate, and that Mr. Piozzi delighted his wife's heart by being received into the Church of England. They became very friendly with the Kembles, and especially Mrs. Siddons, and I cannot do better than quote a somewhat surprising comparison of Mrs. Siddons and Mrs. Pritchard, especially as Mrs. Piozzi was well aware that Mrs. Pritchard was stupid
off the stage, and knew nothing of the play of Macbeth except her own part. 11th of January 1789, quote, Kemble is an agreeable actor, a very sensible and pleasing man. I love him and his charming sister sincerely, but have more sense than to take them for Garrick and Mrs. Pritchard. 'Tis a shame even to have them compared. Mrs. Pritchard was incomparable. Her merit overbore the want of figure. Her intelligence pervaded every sense. She was the most refined coquette of quality in Cibber's Lady Betty, the most vulgar and cunning jade that Ben Jonson could invent in Doll Common, the loftiest Roman matron that Shakespeare could conceive in Coriolanus's mother, the most subtle and artful Millward that Lillo could imagine, capable of inducing the young and innocent prentice boy, the tenderest, the most instinctively tender parent that Voltaire or his translator Hill could give us in Merope, the softest and most subdued penitent that Rowe could exhibit in Jane Shore. Dear Siddons represents only a lover distressed, or a woman of virtue afflicted with peculiar happiness. Elwina, Belvidera, Dianora, Mrs. Beverley, her powers are strong and sweet, vigorous and tasteful, but limited and confined. I always thought Pritchard superior to Garrick. He felt her so in one scene in Hamlet, one of Macbeth, and one of The Jealous Wife, when all the spontaneous applause of the house went to her. 1789, 8th of May. Mrs. Siddons acted Juliet last night. She does it naturally, says someone. So artificially, rather, said I. But she is a great performer. The parting scene with old Nurse was the cleverest thing I ever saw. So pretty, so babyish, so charming. Kemble slept over the parting scene in Romeo. He is like Bottom the Weaver. He likes the tyrant's vein, or Ercles' vein, or a part to tear a cat in, as Bottom says. I never can keep clear of the idea for my part. A lover is too condoling for our friend Kemble. He is a clever man, though, and makes some capital hits in many capital characters. I wonder if my executors will burn the Thraliana." End quote. Mrs. Siddons is such a very great personage in the world of acting that I will quote some more passages, by no means all, in which Mrs. Piozzi mentions her, for we must remember that they became very intimate. Quote, 17th of May, 1790. "Charming Siddons has spent some weeks with me. I think mighty well of her virtues, and am amazed at the cultivated state in which I have found her mind. She is a fine creature, body and soul, and has a very distinguished superiority over other mortals. Poor pretty Siddons! A warm heart and a cold husband are sad things to contend with, but she'll get through." 1st of March, 1791. "I think Mrs. Siddons, though beautiful, and endowed with talents not to support only but enrich her family, is a woman by no means particularly beloved, either by parents, husband, brother or son. They all like to get what they can out of her, but all the affection flows from her to them, not from them to her. I guess not the reason, but 5,000 women are better liked by their families." End quote. In 1794, while living at Streatham, her youngest daughter Cecilia attracted many admirers, among others Samuel Rogers, whose life might have been very different had he married Mrs. Piozzi's daughter. As it was, he became a famous host and literary figure, and at one time might be said to be the representative of literature in London, as Dr. Johnson was 50 years before him. Mrs. Piozzi's entry is, quote, "Mr. Rogers has proposed to Cecilia. He seeks not her fortune, certainly, but he is too ugly to hope acceptance. Who but himself could fancy she would think of him, although banker and poet? She wants neither money nor verses, I suppose, and, like the girl in the comedy, would rather have a husband with white teeth." End quote. It is amusing to find Mrs. Piozzi noting with some annoyance that Rogers gave up visiting them at Streatham after her daughter's marriage, so that it was clear to her that he had only come for the sake of Cecilia, and not for the charms of the mother's conversation. There is a great deal about the affairs of Cecilia, both before and after her marriage in Thraliana, and of some of it I can quite understand Mr. Salisbury's remark that, quote, "it is of too private and delicate character to be submitted to strangers," unquote. As for the three elder daughters, who lived apart from her from the time of her marriage with Piozzi, there was no real intimacy, though the mutual feeling became less unfriendly as time went on. But Mrs. Piozzi had no tolerance or patience for anyone who did not appreciate and respect her dear husband. She was not merely a devoted wife, but found her chief happiness in being a devoted wife to the husband who had given her a second existence of exceptional harmony. Murphy, who had been the man to introduce Johnson to the Thrales, was the old friend for whom her liking remained unimpaired, and with whom she could enjoy a talk about the old times. One passage in Thraliana enables me to make a correction to previous writers. Johnson once made an improvised paraphrase of some Italian verses by Baretti. "Long may live my lovely Hetty, always young and always pretty, always young. Live my lovely Hetty long, always young and always pretty, long may live my lovely Hetty." And both Hayward and Seeley have described these verses as a compliment to Mrs. Thrale. Mrs. Piozzi writes, April 3rd, 1794, "Who would dream of poor Dr. Johnson's verses in praise of my eldest daughter when she was 10 years old, done to divert Baretti by anglicising his song at the end of the baby dialogues, coming out now set to music for the missus to sing? Long may live my lovely Hetty, always young and always pretty, etc., etc." End quote. Footnote: Hayward says she made a note for Sir James Fallows in 1816, quote, "I heard these verses sung at Mrs. Thomas's by 3 voices not 3 weeks ago." End quote. End footnote. In justice to Hayward and Seeley, we must say that in the Anecdotes of Dr. Johnson, from which the verses are quoted, Mrs. Piozzi does not say in whose honour they were composed. Now that we know, we can easily see, as probably Hayward and Seeley could have done, that internal evidence should have told us at once that they were not meant for Mrs. Thrale. Boswell was constantly carping at Mrs. Piozzi's accuracy and correcting her in trivial things. It is curious to find that in 1794 he had a great controversy with Miss Seward in reference to some early verses of Johnson's about a sprig of myrtle. Strange to say, Boswell in this controversy was maintaining the accuracy of Mrs. Piozzi's account of the origin of these verses. If we find this passage in Thraliana, quote, "Mr. Boswell and Miss Seward are good antagonists for each other, made on purpose, one would think. I wonder which will have the last word about poor dear old Johnson's sprig of myrtle. Boswell's cause is best, certainly, but his opponent outrights him. Miss Seward has 10 times his power." End quote. Boswell had committed the unpardonable sin of writing with want of respect about Piozzi, and adopting Johnson's attitude of reprobation about the Piozzi marriage. Mrs. Piozzi, having lived so many years with an Italian artist and travelled in Italy in his company, knew Italian ways as few English women did, and yet kept her English point of view. The following passages concern matters about which people in the 18th century wrote more freely than we do, and both of them have a biographical value. The first relates to, quote, Henry IX, unquote, the last of the Stuarts, and the second to a lady artist, the wife of a famous painter. Quote, I might have heard similar stories to the tales in Suetonius about the Roman emperors in Italy all day, had I not hated lewd conversations as I do. Old Cardinal de York kept a catamite publicly at Rome while I was there, though a man of the best character possible for piety and charity, with which, as a person said to me, that vice has nothing to do. They consider it a mere matter of taste. When Mrs. Cosway ran madding all over Europe after a castrato, leaving her husband and newborn baby at home here, she was praying at every altar and fasting vigorously all the time. A hypocritical hussy, say the people. Not at all. Her faith is not influenced by her actions, I suppose. She was well persuaded of heavenly truths, although a prey to almost infernal passions or appetites strangely depraved. Her taking the veil at Genoa, after all, corroborates my opinion of her piety. Had I been abbess, though, and known her character, she should not have set foot in my convent. The nun's morality would be endangered by such a companion. Side note of Mrs. Piozzi's: she went en pension. She did not take the veil. End note. Mrs. Piozzi's books, Anecdotes of Johnson, 1786, and Letters to and from Johnson, 1788, were both very successful, for the public, or rather society, interest in Johnson lasted for many years after his death. Her account of her Italian journey, 1789, is lively and brightly written, and very much more readable today than most 18th century books of continental travel. These 2 volumes compare very favourably indeed with the 4 volumes of travels by her old enemy Baretti, which were so extravagantly overpraised by Johnson, and for which Baretti received £500 from the booksellers. These books were written because Mrs. Piozzi had something to say. She had things to relate which nobody else could know, and she told her story in a headlong, lively manner that is a near approach to the familiarity of conversation, and has absolutely no relation to the stiff dignity of Johnson's prose style. I am glad to notice that Sir Walter Raleigh, in his chapter on, quote, Johnson without Boswell, unquote, says of Mrs. Piozzi, quote, it is impossible to read the Anecdotes without falling under the spell of her easy, irresponsible charm, unquote. And the essential truth of her picture of Johnson is not vitiated by unimportant errors of detail, brought into an undue prominence by the genius of Boswell. But Mrs. Piozzi's later literary career is not so fortunate. Her British Synonymy, produced in 1794, and sold by the mediation of Murphy and the repute of her former books for £500, was in no way a success, though it was not without some amusing passages. As for her last work, she relates in Thraliana that when she came to London in 1801 with the manuscript of 2 folio volumes, Retrospection, or a review of the most striking and important events, characters, situations and their consequences, which the last 1800 years have presented to the view of mankind, she found the publishers quite resolved not to pay for such a book. She was glad to come to terms with Mr. John Stockdale of Piccadilly on the terms that, quote, Stockdale bears me harmless of expense, and then we share the profits, which will be none, unquote. She adds the further remark, quote, my bargain with Stockdale pleased nobody, I think, unquote. My interest in Mrs. Piozzi has induced me to buy these 2 folio volumes, and I may say that in the later part of the 2nd volume Her comments on the extraordinary events of her own time have some human and almost historical interest, though they are very awkwardly expressed. That is the best I can say of them. With regard to Thraliana, I should like to adopt the phrase of Professor Raleigh, and say that in the reading of it I have fallen under the spell of Mrs. Piozzi's easy, irresponsible charm. The specimens I have given may or may not bring this home to those who have not had the privilege of dipping into Thraliana for themselves and reading in her own handwriting the sincere and private records of a remarkable woman. Sometimes it is so intimate that one feels as if, quote, profaning the mysteries of the bona dea, unquote, to use a convenient phrase employed by Lord Beaconsfield. The full flavour can only be obtained by a full perusal. It is a veracious document, the real thing, the genuine article. My endeavour has been to give fair samples, not to expurgate unduly, and to try to convey to others the historical, literary and human charm of Thraliana. Dates in the life of Mrs. Piozzi. 1741, Hester Lynch Salisbury born, January the 27th, daughter of John Salisbury of Bachycrag. 1762, death of her father. 1763, her marriage to Henry Thrale, brewer of Southwark and Streatham. 1764, birth of her eldest daughter Hester, afterwards Lady Keith. She bore Thrale 12 children in all. 1765, first introduction to Johnson. Thrale MP for Southwark. 1766, Johnson became domesticated at Streatham and spent henceforth much of his time there, usually the middle of the weeks, returning to his London house on Saturday evenings. 1769, Boswell's first visit to Streatham. 1773, death of Mrs. Thrale's mother. 1774, tour in Wales of the Thrales and Dr. Johnson. On their return they visit Burke at Beaconsfield. 1775, in September, Mr. and Mrs. Thrale with their eldest daughter and Johnson and Baretti visit France, 8 weeks abroad. 1776, death of the Thrales' eldest son, a boy of 10. 1778, first visit of Fanny Burney, Madame D'Arblay, to Streatham. 1780, Gordon writes, Thrale loses his seat for Streatham. First acquaintance with Piozzi. 1781, death of Thrale, sale of the brewery. 1782, Streatham House let to Lord Shelburne. 1783, Piozzi sent to Italy. Mrs. Thrale retires to Bath. 1784, marriage to Piozzi. Departure of Mr. and Mrs. Piozzi for Italy. Death of Johnson, December the 13th. 1787, Mr. and Mrs. Piozzi return to England. 1790, the Piozzis go to live at the old house at Streatham. 1795, they leave Streatham for North Wales to live on Mrs. Piozzi's ancestral estate. 1809, death of Piozzi. 1821, death of Mrs. Piozzi in May. She left his Welsh property to Piozzi's nephew, who took the name of Salisbury. End of section 4. End of Mrs. Piozzi's Thraliana by Charles Hughes.